Good morning, Stephen. Thanks for agreeing to this interview as part of the IAMA 70th anniversary series. If I may, I'd like to start by working chronologically through your career to date, stopping here and there to examine specific issues in more detail, and then just ask you a few more general questions. You attended Westminster School, where you were a choral singer and discovered your lifelong passion for record collecting. You went on to read modern languages and law at Magdalen College, Cambridge University. Your entrepreneurial instincts were then demonstrated in some style when you co-founded the Oxford and Cambridge Shakespeare Company, which toured his plays in the United States. How did that come about?
Well, as a student at Cambridge, I needed employment in the summer. So I acted as a courier for a company called Specialized Travel, taking large groups of Americans around Europe who'd never been to Europe before. Vaguely remember, 74 Texan dentists, the Moravian College Choir, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and basically large groups of Americans who hadn't been to Europe before. And it was, if it's Tuesday, it must be Brussels. If it's Wednesday, it must be Berlin. It was 2 days in different cities in Europe for 6 weeks. And I discovered during the course of those tours that Shakespeare was basically a dead language for Americans. It was like Latin or Greek. It was a language that wasn't alive, and it sounded like something very, very difficult to understand and not pleasurable either. And of course, I was involved in theatre at Cambridge and toured Europe with a Shakespeare company. And of course, to the English, Shakespeare is a living language and can be done in fresh ways that can be interesting and attractive. So I sort of conceived the idea with a friend of mine from Oxford and another friend from Cambridge who was president of the Footlights, Jonathan James Moore, to set up a company of all the best drama societies in Oxford and Cambridge Shakespeare Company, and to try and tour American universities to show that a fresh, youthful, people of their age playing Shakespeare, where the language felt natural and normal and conversational. And that grew into really quite a major project because we wrote, 2,000 letters to all the American colleges and so. We booked our own first tour, and Jonathan Miller came to do our next 2 productions, and we had a professional designer sets, and we traveled around. We did 35 one-night stands in 42 days, ranging from the Ivy League, Harvard, and so on to, Morgantown, West Virginia, and Charlottesville. And we had a wonderful time. And somehow or other, on that kind of basis, I learnt a lot about touring, about shifting people around, and also the groups that we took around Europe. And we had 3 years of this, and it was a wonderful experience. Wonderful.
Fantastic introduction to the nuts and bolts of touring.
Yes, definitely touring. I mean, we met all kinds of obstacles. We had to do setups in 2 hours in cinemas where the screen was raised, and we had to go on 2 hours later with a Shakespeare play and so on. It was a fascinating experience, and it was culturally fascinating because it was 1969, 70, and 71 when the American student scene was riddled with anti-Vietnam politics, and we went from a gung-ho American military college in Plattsburgh, New York State, where we were pelted with food by the recruits to the army who thought we were a bunch of long-haired gits, to Sweetbriar College in Virginia, where the 800 girls were eating dinner with white gloves, and the campus was protected by Pinkerton detectives. So we had a very wide cultural introduction to America. Taught me forever that America local communities vary enormously. And it was fascinating.
Particularly interesting time to go there because that was a time when things were changing so much.
Yes,
so it must
indeed,
have been a very interesting experience. But it's an amazingly ambitious project for young people.
It was crazy. Had we known the difficulties it had, basically the film company that was due to film the Footlights review that we took on the first show went bankrupt a week before they were due to film, and they provided the main finance for the first tour. So we had to decide whether to cancel the entire operation or somehow raise the money for the flights and just hope that we'd find, success there. And in the end, we decided to raise the money for the flights, and the parents of a lot of the actors helped. And we got to America, we did the first successful tour, and on the last day, we found an agent to book us the next tour. So we were lucky.
When you were at Cambridge, you studied modern languages and law, which I suppose, with hindsight, is almost a perfect combination, really, for someone going into the agency world. Not everybody has those skills, even in this business today. Did you find that was a useful combination, and did you enjoy Cambridge generally?
I loved Cambridge, but then I didn't work very hard. I basically spent my time I sort of co-founded the Cambridge Opera Company with Nick Snowman and spent my time with theatre and music and just about got my degree in law and modern languages. Yes, of course, it was useful. I mean, I think I would have made a dreadful lawyer, and I didn't enjoy the law, but what it did do, which I think is incredibly important in the arts in general and the classical music business, is it was an excellent mental training for looking at vast masses of problems and very characterful people, eccentric and difficult and what have you, and somehow prioritizing an order in which you deal with those problems. So the legal training for me was hopeless for the law, because I would not have been a good lawyer, I don't think. But it did give me a mental framework of tackling masses of information and varied messes and so on and so forth. As did being a courier for the travel agency, because when you're taking 74 people around, you're the only courier, and you're doing 10 towns in 15 days, and you're getting people on and off planes and into hotels. You do run across lots and lots of logistical problems, and understanding how to deal with all of that is good mental training.
America was key to your next move into artist management with Shaw Concerts, for whom you set up and ran their European office. What was the connection with them, and who were the artists involved initially? How did that all happen?
Well, Harold Shaw was a very old-fashioned personal manager, bow tie, softly spoken, had started in the business in 1946, and was a very old-fashioned, by American standards, very old-fashioned manager, very courteous, very gentle, very thoughtful, long-term, and all this sort of thing. He was the agent who we got on the last day of the first tour of the Oxford and Cambridge Shakespeare Company. So he acted as our agent, booked our next two tours, then told me that he was opening a European office of managing artists and orchestras and so on, and would I like to run it? And I said, I knew nothing about the agency business at all. I was completely green. I said, yes, of course, because music had always been my first passion ahead of theatre. And I'd been collecting records since I was, 12 years old. And basically, he was setting up this office from scratch. He managed a whole roster of very interesting, basically English artists, John Shirley Quirk, Robert Tier, Ben Luxon, Julian Bream, John Williams, Andrew Davis, Ray Leppard, and so there was that. And then on the American side, there was Maureen Forrester, Frederica von Stade, Garrick Olson, Miriam Fried, and so my job was twofold. One was to keep the European artists happy about their American representation. The other was to develop the work of the European-based concerts for the American artists, and there I had to work through all the local agents in Europe, the Ibsen Tillits, the Harold Holtz, the Schmidt office, and so on, all of whom regarded me as an absolute American interloper, as it were, Trojan horse, and so on. So it took me time to develop those relationships. He also managed Horowitz for a period, so I got involved in Horowitz's management, which was a fascinating experience. And he was a lovely man. He was a really lovely man.
So was he the kind of key mentor early on? I'm just wondering, who influenced you in your early days? And what were the early lessons?
Well, the early lessons were, some of it carried through the rest of my life and career, which was that he tended to do everything not in writing, but on the phone and in meetings and so on. So when I'd write him a carefully argued note saying, on the one hand, on the other, he'd photocopy it and send it back saying, is this a yes or is this a no, sort of thing. And the other thing is, in those days, of course, everything was done by correspondence in Europe, and there were assistants who typed and all that sort of thing. And he taught me a number of business lessons about cash flow, about profitability, about the commercial side of the agency. And it was very, very well organized, his office, in terms of booking, and the kind of sales aspect of an American concert agency was, foremost in his mind. He had to make money, and he had to get lots of bookings for his clients and earn a good living from it, basically. And for instance, he told me that I should learn to dictate all my notes, all my letters, all my correspondence on a little dictating machine. And that was sort of state of the art in those days. When I came back and did that in England, everyone thought I was mad. It's now rather antediluvian, but I still do all my correspondence dictated every morning.
You then joined Harold Holt and rose to the position eventually of joint managing director. At this point, you had a group of very distinguished individual clients, and I think you were also very active by then in orchestra touring.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that I sort of founded the proper orchestral touring department of Holt with Andrew Jameson and Tonino Howard in order to develop both a UK touring circuit, which Andrew is still involved in, I believe, and was very successful, and also to do major European tours. Holt, until that point, had mainly presented the great orchestras in London, but hadn't done a lot of touring operation. And again, the work with the theatre company and the work with the travel agency, that was a very good grounding, and yes, I did involve. And on the artist side, yes, I tended to specialize in Eastern Europe, so I built up particularly a strong roster of Russian artists, so Temyakanov, Svetlanov, Gutman, Vyasaladze, Spivakov, Alexeyev, and so on, and sort of specialized in that area because Holt didn't do that till then. And also Polish and other East European artists touring there as well. I think we took the BBC Symphony with John Pritchard and Temyakanov to Russia for the first time in the late 80s and so on. Yes, those two things.
And you worked a lot with Maksimiuk and the Polish Chamber Orchestra, I think, didn't you?
Yes, I did
remember
indeed.
that.
I did indeed.
Yeah. Who were the key managers, generally, not just in touring, but within the company at Holt at the time, and who did you admire any of them, and why?
Yes, I did indeed admire. I mean, it was a very small company. When I joined, I think there were 8 people or 9 people only.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we were handed our correspondence by the chairman, Sir Ian Hunter, at a morning meeting called Prayers at 9 o'clock. Martin Campbell-White and Diana Ricks and I would come in, and we would have our correspondence handed to us that had been opened with a silver letter by Ian Hunter, and, this letter from the Concertgebouw, I think this is the way you should reply to it, and so on. So, it was like a little family. It was a lovely place to work. And I admired Diana Ricks because of the meticulous way she looked after great artists such as Kubelik and Barenboim and so on. And I admired Martin. I thought Martin was a wonderful manager.
In 1991, just as my own career as an agent was starting, so I vividly remember all the fuss at the time, you were somewhat contentiously recruited by IMG to set up IMG Artists Europe. My understanding is that IMG had been negotiating to buy Harold Holt, but the deal collapsed and they subsequently hired you and your team instead. One leading London agent allegedly referred to this as a major moral lapse on your part. Were you concerned about reputational damage at the time?
I think one's always concerned about reputational damage because in our business, trust and confidence and your reputation are critical to being able to be trusted by people whom you're selling and so on and so forth. But I think the story of I don't know whether it's still an issue of any kind anywhere, it's history, but the story of that particular episode, there was a sort of gagging order on all the arrangements for a number of years, so I've never really spoken openly about it, but I'm happy to do so now because it's not quite what people have heard. So this is quite difficult to remember the sequence, but basically there were financial problems at Harold Holt, I think it's fair to say. There was a lack of investment availability to expand the company in the way I felt it should be, and I was a member of the board, and I was very active, if not actually leading the touring circuits, and also I was very interested in audiovisual, and there were no funds for that. The company didn't make much money, and indeed the income was going down. So when IMG made an offer, as you say, for the whole company, I welcomed it. I thought this was the right way forward, and I thought that if Mark McCormack, in acquiring a small New York agency, Edna Landau and Charlie Hamlin, had treated them as well as he did, then the same kind of care and overseeing care despite there being a large American company, would be given to a European purchase. And we had lots of discussions with IMG, and the board of Harold Holt were opposed to it, with the exception of me. I was in favor of it and said so. And I said I thought that was the way of the future. And the board said to me that they would like me to stay, not leave, whilst they looked for another alternative investor to IMG, because they thought they could find an alternative to IMG, and they felt that, how shall I put it, IMG were, Americans interested in profit only, not the right kind of fit with Harold Holt, and so on and so forth. I didn't feel that. So I said, yes, I would stay, because they'd given me 15 very good years, and I thought that was a fair request. So I stayed with the company for 18 months, whilst they looked round with me in the forefront, because I led a profitable department, to try and find an alternative investor, and they couldn't. And then something happened whereby, for reasons, internal reasons, a loss was made on a major orchestra tour, not run by me. And IMG lowered their offer. And that provoked great anger and irritation on the board. I thought it was perfectly normal that they should do so. And I realized then that I had to go, because I believed IMG was the future for the kind of work I was doing, the artists I managed, and the developments I wanted. And so I left with, 25 employees and my divisions. But I said to IMG that I was not prepared to come to them unless they compensated Harold Holt with a decent sum of money to cover my departure, because I didn't want Harold Holt to suffer financially. And IMG in the end, and I was involved in this, paid £660,000 to Harold Holt, which I believe enabled them to not only continue, but to develop and flourish in the way they have. And I was then free to leave. But the details of that arrangement were not allowed to be publicized. So I certainly don't feel there was any moral turpitude involved. On the contrary, I feel that I helped my company as best I could in the circumstances, and IMG were not best pleased to know that I wouldn't leave unless they paid £650,000 to Harold Holt.
IMG subsequently backed you in a number of major ventures, which I suppose is really the point of the whole idea from your side, including setting up offices in Paris and Kuala Lumpur, a substantial audio-visual division, the BBC Legends record label, and the acquisition of managers and their clients from other agencies. In those days, IMG was owned and run by Mark McCormack, and although he sometimes got a bad press, nicknamed Mark the Shark, for example, it seems to me that he strongly supported your ambitions. What was he like to work with?
He was wonderful to work with, absolutely wonderful. He was very tough, but he had a business philosophy that was to interrogate fiercely any proposal you made, to make the case for it, with tough rules attached, then to back you 100%, and then to leave you alone to do it. And all the mergers and acquisitions, one of the things you didn't mention, he enabled the Art of Conducting program, which is one of the best things I feel I've done, produced that. He enabled that to be financed because he understood and believed in what it was. And he was, I think he was a wonderful employer, absolutely wonderful. And he supported the artist division and supported its development, supported its expansion, and got it, understood what we were doing, which was to build something that encompassed all aspects of the classical music management scene, whether it was making audiovisual programs, whether it was having a vocal department, whether it was having an expanding orchestral touring department, whether it needed investment. And that's the thing, and IMG had the resources. So he was a wonderful employer.
So he challenged you when you presented ideas, but ultimately he was supportive and he didn't interfere, and he trusted you to run the company for him.
Yes, and I think when I joined, we were 25 people, and by the time I left, 15 years later, we were 95 people, and we had the vocal department, we had the Paris office, we'd done the Malaysian project, which was huge. And, we developed into the areas that to me felt right, appropriate, interesting, exciting, and all that sort of stuff. He was an expansionist. He was someone who believed in development and moving, whereas the classical music business had tended until that time to be rather static in terms of its development.
Yes, indeed. Historically, over the last sort of half century, in general, it has been quite static, hasn't it? Apart from the odd moment of someone stepping in like this, which is unusual, I think. You've probably provoked more change in the agency business than anyone else. You took your team from Harold Holt to start IMG Artists Europe, then brought in a team from Lees Askenis, resulting in due course to those left behind merging as Askenis Holt. You brought in another division from Harrison Parrott. After leaving IMG, you bought Van Walsum Management. These were most of the leading agencies when I entered the business, and you've significantly impacted them all. In a business where there's very little M&A activity, you seem to have been one of the only people willing to think on that scale. I guess you had the backing, the ambition, and the imagination. Did you ever worry, though, that agencies are simply too fragile, low-margin people businesses with no real assets to buy and sell?
That's an interesting question. No, I never felt that, because buying and selling, it's a difficult phrase it doesn't really apply to these mergers and acquisitions, because to me, the fact is that the key to all of this are the staff. If in persuading a management that they'd get more opportunities, more possibilities at IMG, if the managers are convinced that this is the case, or the case is made, then their artists will follow them. You can't buy and sell artists. And therefore there is a big risk in this, in that, if the managers want to come, their artists are free to come or to stay. And some of them may want to stay with as it were, the former company or the company they were with. But I think once you've convinced the managers, the trust factor between the manager and the artist should be such that the manager says to the artist, for these reasons, I believe that this is a good or a better future for you, and therefore come with us. So no, I don't think they're too fragile. I think the key is the manager. The relationship of trust is between the artist and the manager. Persuading a manager, and they want to persuade their artist, that the working circumstances and the careers of the artist will be improved or in a secure place with an audiovisual division and an orchestral touring division and, all the other attributes that IMG Artists had under McCormack's leadership.
I guess some of these investments were simply bringing in people, attracting people. And in the case of Van Walsum, for example, it was the purchase of an actual company. It was the buying of a business. And there's a clear difference, isn't there, between those two activities? There is. I mean, the Van Walsum experience was IMG Artists changed its ownership. Sadly, Mark McCormack passed away in 2002, I think, 2003. And there was new ownership, which was very different and not as sympathetic to the McCormack aims and style. And therefore, when I left IMG, I did feel that I had unfinished business, if you want. I'd left. I mean, I think if Mark McCormack had, as it were, continued to live, I could still be at IMG Artists today, because he was a wonderful and inspiring sort of leader and someone who backed all those developments. Let's talk for a moment about the third-party ownership of agencies. Based on your experience and on the other examples we all know about, do you think the model is realistic? Was it difficult to be owned by a much larger and more profitable business? Was it a price worth paying, perhaps, in order to be able to do more ambitious projects than most other agencies?
I think the answer is about the nature and motives of any third-party owner who comes in and wants to purchase an agency. My experience is that generally, these people who want to do it, they look at the business initially and think, oh God, they don't make much money. We should be able to improve on that hugely. somewhere we should be able to improve it a little, a lot, but generally a lot. So most third-party owners come in with an assumption that they are taking over something that is very poorly run, doesn't make much money, and doesn't make sense. And they, because of their wonderful experience in all kinds of other fields, will be able to transform this. I would say even Mark McCormack took that view to a degree. But he sent in, so this is an example of someone who thinks the right way about this. He said to himself in his mind, I don't really understand this. It makes very little money and it seems to be very complicated, labor intensive with low commissions and, an awful lot of talk and difficult people and so on. It doesn't make sense. So he sent in one of his sort of top business friends, I think it was the ex-chief executive of General Motors, to spend sort of 6 months with us and, as it were, x-ray the business and give the views. And I suppose a simple summary of what this man did at the end was, I've looked at this business, it doesn't make much sense, it shouldn't work, but it somehow does. Leave them alone. They know what they're doing. They are as good as anyone else in the business. Now that seems to me a very sensible way of having evaluated. And I think that there is this assumption that when acquiring something, you can change it, make it better, and what have you, because most of the people who have acquired, third-party people who have acquired an agency, do come either from big business or, dangerously, they have a certain knowledge about music from a certain point of view, and they assume that the agency business is terrible or dishonest or full of charlatans or what have you. And people with agendas who come in and buy agencies, they would be well advised to look very carefully at how it's run, why it's run, what the difficulties are, because we all know it's incredibly difficult to run an agency and to make a decent margin. It's very difficult. I mean, after all, if you take the crudest example, a 20% commission, once you break down all your costs, you are left between 1 and 9% or 10% if you're lucky, and 5% if you're not, and 0 if you're not. So the margins are automatically built into a commission system that some could argue is too low. Literary agents take 30 or 35%. There are others who take 25%. There is an argument to say that a 20% commission is a dangerously low margin for any business to make a decent profit. So I'd say third-party purchases of agencies are dangerous animals unless there is an intelligent and enlightened and respectful purchaser who doesn't automatically assume and then apply the rules to change everything. Because he's dealing with professionals who've been in the business for 20 or 30 years and who do know what they're doing, mainly.
Yes, there's a temptation to naively think you can come in and change things and improve things, isn't there? And I think if you're acquired in that scenario, that's probably what you dread, that someone who doesn't know enough about it is going to mess around with things for a while and distract you.
And there are examples historically of people who have done that.
Yeah.
And there are people who, having done that, don't succeed and then either on sale or close down or have already blown up the agency.
And as you say, I mean, agencies are essentially quite low margin, even I suspect the most successful. So the potential for profit for a third-party owner is probably not what they hope it is. Certainly they won't be able to change it dramatically.
And someone who was associated with the higher echelons of IMG corporately did say after a few years, he said to me, Stephen, I think I've gathered what this business basically is. It's a lifestyle business for the people who are in it. It's not really a business. And there's some truth in that. The people who go into this business, we don't have formal training as agents. There's no university course. No university course that's worth it. You learn on the job, and you learn in this very messy world of, the finances of the classical music business are partly philanthropic if you are in the Anglo-Saxon world, heavily state if you're in the Central European world. And so, the money sources are very strange, and they don't always allow for making large margins because they're state funding for a start. So, there are many aspects of this that don't make profit sense.
And I think there's an argument also that from time to time, if an agency looks as if it's doing a little too well, then there's a PR problem with artists who look at it and say, well, we're the people who are funding this in effect, and this doesn't look as if it's imbalanced. I think there's a danger of looking too corporate, and you can almost look too successful. And I understand that, because the artists, ultimately, you're working for them, and they feel that you should have a similar experience to them.
And there is a traditional music hall view of agents as people in yellow waistcoats, rather vulgar, smoking cigars and taking their 10%. What in the classical music business no one's quite understood until they're in it is the sheer labour-intensive below-the-waterline servicing, the whole servicing aspect of an engagement. If you went through all the details of someone from the outside, they'd be amazed.
Yes, I certainly agree that we do a lot for our 20%, that's for sure, hence the slim margin.
Yes.
So we've established you left IMG in 2005 after McCormack had died and the ownership had changed. You then started to build a highly successful consultancy business. Who were the early clients there?
The first big project which led to a client was I worked for Sir Peter Moores as his advisor for 30 years, and he decided to make a commercial film of the Magic Flute, budget £15 million, and sort of put me in charge of it. And so we got Kenneth Branagh, and we did this film, and it was an extraordinary experience. And that was a consultancy. It was the first big consultancy. And then that led to a consultancy which is, to this day, with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe. And I also worked for theatre projects on new buildings because, a major project in IMG days was the Malaysian Philharmonic Concert Hall. And I did a kind of audiovisual report on the entire Gulbenkian Foundation's projects, audiovisual, visual, their art collection, their concert hall, and so on and so forth. And I did a couple of other audiovisual reports for Göteborg, for instance, and so on. Interesting work.
I'm guessing you enjoyed being able to focus even more on the audiovisual projects, because I know that's something you really love.
Yes. Yes.
Would you have liked or considered a full-time career in the record industry or in broadcasting?
Yes, but the agency work I've been describing to you covers so many different interesting directions that would have been, I would have considered it, but it would have been a limiting process, because after all, if you look at all the things I've been able to do, they are very wide and varied, and they kind of answer my various interests.
Yes, and I've always felt that the agency world offers that variety and in a way, a unique opportunity in the music industry to do a bit of everything.
Yes, if you have someone at your side who's willing to invest, take risks, and who understands the culture of this development is not a short-term or necessarily a commercial one. There's an element of public money, and there's an element of not quite philanthropy, but enlightened investment in any project that, the building of a new concert hall is basically either the government or donations or a combination of both.
I remember chatting to you around that time, and you seemed to be having a great deal of fun working with a wide variety of clients and in areas that really interested you. So what made you enter the bidding for Van Walsum Management when it was for sale? Did you have a particular vision for where you could take that company? I think you've already said you maybe had a bit of unfinished business in artist management.
Well, yes. I left IMG and became a consultant, and I did feel that, that my life at IMG Artists was somewhat prematurely cut off for a number of reasons. Not least the fact that my wife developed terminal cancer. That's one of the reasons I stepped down. But I thought that Van Walsum was a very well-run agency, very good artists, very strong management and so on. And they actually approached me, Jessica and Rachel, to become managing director of the company. And I said no to that, but I said that if it were available for sale, I would be interested. And they said it was. So that's how that happened.
Having bought the company, you changed the name to International Classical Artists and set up the ICA Classics CD and DVD label, which is still very active today and has an amazing catalogue and of mainly historical recordings, of course, a real treasure trove. You also continued with a number of your consultancy clients, I believe. You must have been very busy, and in this scenario, you didn't have the resources of IMG backing you up, of course.
It's all true. Yes, I remained very busy. I don't know. I found that there was interest in doing work, and so I'm a bit of a workaholic, so...
Artist management seems to become ever more competitive as time passes, and in this case, in addition, of course, the Van Walsums eventually started a new agency, which must have been a surprise to you, and a further challenge for ICA. Did you eventually regret returning to the agency business, with hindsight?
No, I didn't regret returning to it, and yes, it was a surprise to me that they started their agency.
You eventually reached an agreement with one of your staff, Alexandra Knight, who took on most of your agency clients, and you're now a consultant to her business, Knight Classical, while still maintaining your portfolio of individual consultancies, including Strasbourg Philharmonic, Colburn School, and the Chamber Orchestra of Europe. I get the impression you're working as hard as ever. You obviously still love it.
I do love it. And yes, I'm working as hard as ever. Well, not quite as hard as ever, because, being a consultant is, in a way, thank goodness, different from having to work at the coalface the whole time and be responsible for a group of employees, which is quite difficult at times.
But I can tell from the time of your emails that you do start work quite early every day.
Yes, I do.
Having covered the main stages of your career, let's turn to a few general questions, just for fun. Which artist have you most enjoyed working with?
Oh, that's a very difficult one. I think my 25 years with Maris Janssens was a highlight. I think that the 10 years I spent with Celibidache and the tours of the LSO and the Munich Philharmonic, especially the Munich Philharmonic to the States with Celibidache, was an extraordinary experience. I think my 25 years with Neville Marriner were quite wonderful. And in general, I loved working for Russian artists because under communism, which it then was still, the role of the artist and the quality of the academic training, Russian conductors have a technique second to none. And looking after Svetlana, for instance, who after 40 years in England didn't speak a word of English, but did it all just with the stick and the eyes and produced amazing results from London orchestras. That was just a pure joy.
I guess that era, it was the Cold War at the beginning of that period still, and these people, it wasn't easy for them to come to the West. You must have got sucked into some of all those complications.
Oh yes. But also I had a Polish wife. My wife Jagna knew all about the Russians, was under Russian thrall in Poland and all.
Yes.
And she was there. She was, for the first 7 years of our marriage, she was the interpreter for a lot of these Russians. And they behaved in a way, in general, because in Russia the conductor was absolute god. They could do absolutely anything. They had all kinds of privileges, quite different. So they assumed that their role in society when they came to the West was an extraordinarily privileged one. They could do anything they wanted, they could bend any programming they wanted, they could get any privilege they wanted. And it wasn't the case. In the West, the artist is just, the conductor is just could be a bus conductor as far as most people are concerned.
Which other agencies and individual agents have you admired over the years and why?
Well, of course, the early years, my life, allowed for various styles of management. And for instance, if you want the old guard, say Sir Hunter at Harold Holt, say Hans Schmidt at the Konzertdirektion, say not Hans-Dieter Görer, but say Hans Adler. The old styles, they were more impresarios than agents, and therefore I was sort of brought up under those. And then the next generation down, and people like Martin Campbell-White, Jasper Parrott, and the next level, Terry Harrison, and so on and so forth, they were the younger people who wanted to change that rather patrician, old-fashioned view I mean, Ian Hunter told me a story once that when he took over Harold Holt in 1953, I think it was, that the then manager of the LPO, Eric Bravington, would arrive in his office with the diary of the 30 concerts at the festival hall empty. And he would say, "Mr. Hunter, do please tell me who is available for these dates?" And then they would fill, I don't know, a quarter, a third, with other artists who were simply available. So the competition has become ferocious for every single date, not just with London, but elsewhere. And in those days, it was a very gentlemanly business, I thought.
If only, eh? Yes, those are the days.
Yes.
Which project are you most proud of?
I think the Malaysian Concert Hall project, that was lead consultants to the Malaysian government and Petronas on the fitting out, staffing and programming of the new Philharmonic Hall at the base of the Twin Towers. And the story behind that was so fascinating because the Prime Minister, Mahathir, had said to the chairman of Petronas, "You've built those Twin Towers. I think we need a concert hall in Kuala Lumpur. You've got a space in the middle. Would you build one?" So Tan Sri Azizan, who was the visionary behind the chairman of Petronas, he built this $300 million concert hall with Kierkegaard and IAMA, and it only, because of the space available, it could only hold 863 seats. So therefore, building a full symphony orchestra hall with only 863 seats is sort of commercial madness. But they had the vision to bring classical music to Malaysia. They built, or we built with them and for them, the Malaysian Philharmonic, which at that time I think was almost immediately the finest Asian orchestra. And, the music director was an extraordinary man who's not as well known as he should have been, Kees Barkels, who was a brilliant orchestral trainer. He did 4,000 auditions worldwide for the position, and he chose, like a Swiss watchmaker, he said, that's the right person for the fourth desk of violins on the inside stand. So the orchestra, chosen in that way, all assembled one June day in 1998 or whatever it was. They'd never met each other, they never played together, and they all assembled in this hall. And when the first chords of Dvorak 6 sounded, within 10 seconds we looked at each other and thought, this is a great orchestra from the first few bars. So that was the most extraordinary project. Never repeated. We earned a good fee for that. And Ian Smallbone, who was the head of the team there, and I had great fun. Great difficulty too. They wouldn't allow the Messiah to be performed because it was Old Testament language, and that wouldn't do.
Right.
But then we persuaded them that since Menuhin was going to conduct that, they had to make an exception. So the chairman of Petronas went to the Prime Minister and said, "We have to bend the rules for that." So it was all frontier stuff and thoroughly enjoyable. And I suppose the BBC Legends label for me was a major, unlocking the BBC archives and finding all those treasures, wonderful performances dating back to 1935, was a project I'm proud of, and the art of conducting.
What's been your biggest mistake or regret?
Oh, we all make mistakes. I've made lots of them. But I don't think I can highlight one because there have been lots. I suppose my main regret has to be that Mark McCormack passed away so early. Because as I say, he was such a supportive, and I understood his management style and I was happy to work with it. And he was happy to invest and support. And that is a great regret to me.
Yes, that was cut a bit short, wasn't it? And
it was.
The potential to do more was clearly there. But
yes.
As you say, the regime change after that was the end of that, really, wasn't it?
Yes.
And there hasn't really been a comparable situation since, I guess.
No.
Post-COVID, the market's undoubtedly shrunk somewhat for classical music, and it's proving quite challenging to rebuild the audience. What changes do you think are needed in the industry, and in particular, how do you think agencies need to respond now?
I think that's very difficult for me to answer because I'm no longer really in the agency business. I've been a consultant now for 3.5 years. And what I observe by working for orchestras and others is that I think the audience renewal and expansion is the critical problem. And I would ascribe that, as I've always done all my life, to music education. It's like the Jesuits, give me a child of 5 and he is mine for life. So if we do not, in a major, major way, reintroduce music education from a very young age, in 30 or 40 years, we won't have much of a classical music, and it will have fragmented, and it will have become, the sales techniques needed to sell people and so on. So I think, to me, music education is at the absolute root of future audiences.
And that's the same answer I suspect that you would give in terms of the equality and diversity agenda, that, again, it needs to be offered at a very young age to young kids coming into school, given the same opportunities as everybody else.
Yes, absolutely.
The largest agencies seem to be growing very quickly at the moment, with new signings being announced very frequently, almost daily it seems. You've run agencies of all sizes. Do you have a view on the optimal size for such a business? Is there such a thing? Or does it simply depend on the ratio of staff to artists and the quality of internal communication within that agency?
I think both your statements are true. There is a size issue and there is a quality of staff and artists issue. And my impression is that either very small, boutique, or very large are the ways that you have to go, and aggregate if you're very large, because the middle gets squeezed. You have a difficulty with staff and artist ratio and profit margins and so on. Whereas if you're 3 people and you've got 15 artists who are good owners and so on, there is a model that works for that. But on the other hand, the services that a top artist requires are provided not by the 3 people, but by the large agency with various arms. But I think the large agency model, if you look at what's happened to Cami and Opus 3, and even IMG, which is now not quite the same broad church as it used to be, because they had to rationalize certain aspects. I think the large agency model is a difficult one unless you've got a backer with a belief and investment money to take a 5, 10, 15-year view of that.
Do you think conductors have lost their authority due to the pressure to be liked? Orchestra surveys are pretty much the norm now, but some might suggest that this does not always lead to the best booking decisions. Bullying behaviour is obviously completely unacceptable, but do orchestras sometimes need to be challenged a bit more?
What an interesting and political question that is. Let me think for a moment. The conductor's job is to handle 100 different personalities, all with high technical skills, mostly playing different instruments, and weld them into a harmonious one instrument, the orchestra style of playing. So in order to do that, he has to have such a wide variety of skills, which include the ability to command musical respect from the orchestra, the ability to weld them and to deal with personalities and so on. And I think there is a degree of autocracy about a conductor's makeup that is required. We are all a happy family here, we all play out of love and respect for each other, is a great theory, but it has to be applied. And if you apply it to a difficult orchestra or a particularly high-class orchestra, you've got to command respect, and commanding respect sometimes comes with commanding authority. And commanding authority sometimes comes with a degree of autocracy and discipline and what have you. So I think it's not the word liked that you use, it might be respected. A conductor has to command respect. Respect will command a willingness to participate as a member of a team. So I think that's my formula. I think a degree of autocracy or a degree of being able to apply those disciplines I've outlined is an essential for a conductor.
Is it possible that sometimes in this process at the moment, the way that it's done at the moment, we confuse liked and respected slightly, and that the surveys may sometimes reflect whether someone is liked more than whether or not they're respected, because a lot of the time the purpose of the survey is to determine whether the orchestra wants to re-engage that artist?
Yes, I think there is a big problem about orchestral musicians' responses to conductors. I'd throw a question back to you. Do you think that a group of orchestral musicians are inevitably the best judges of a conductor?
Well, as a former player, I can only say that I never found great consistency of response to conductors anyway. So if I was playing in the festival hall with the LPO, in my time with them, as we came off stage, I would hear a person to my right saying that's the best concert we've ever done, a person to my left saying that was a terrible concert. And we'd all take part in the same thing. And I used to find that quite entertaining and confusing, because actually we've all taken part in this. How can we possibly have such different views of what's just happened? And if there had been a survey of those people at that time, the results would have been completely confusing.
Yes, and I'm reminded about the only occasion when Carlos Kleiber conducted a genius, probably the finest conductor I've ever heard in my life. He conducted an LSO concert at the Festival Hall while he was at Covent Garden. Freischütz, Mozart 33, and I think Brahms 4. And it was one of the greatest concerts I've ever heard in my life. And then it appeared the next day, to my absolute astonishment, 4 terrible reviews for Carlos Kleiber, saying, I don't know, all kinds of ridiculous things, but all 4 national newspapers, followed by Peter Hayworth in the Observer saying, I'm ashamed of my colleagues. It was one of the greatest concerts. So in other words, you sometimes wonder whether you were at the same experience. So the judgments on whether a concert has gone well or badly between an agent and an artist are very, very complicated, because the judgment is actually carried out by the manager of the orchestra, who may or may not rebook, the orchestra themselves, the press, the artist himself, and so on. So it's very difficult to judge an artistic experience objectively.
And I suppose there's an argument for saying that the person who is doing the booking ultimately is making a choice on the basis of what that orchestra needs. So sometimes it may not be the most popular choice, the most obvious choice, but they may feel that that conductor is right for that orchestra because of what they bring, their particular skills and discipline, and that may be useful to that orchestra. And that's an aspect that I'm sure everyone does take it into account. It's clearly very important.
Yes, and if Fred Smith fills the festival hall, somewhat to their surprise, and gives a bad concert, he may be re-invited.
One of the biggest changes during your time in the music industry has been the rise and fall in recording income for artists, followed now by the hope of a further rise due to streaming. But the present streaming model is problematic for classical artists. Do you think it will be possible ever to improve the deal, perhaps through payment by the second, for example, rather than by the track, which seems an arbitrary system in place at the moment, which isn't fair for classical repertoire, which tends to have much longer tracks?
I think you've asked 2 different questions there. The first question is whether the remuneration structure for streaming is fair, which it isn't, and can be changed. And the second is how has the effect of recording and the importance of recording changed? I think the answer to the second question is, these streaming or digital channels, Spotify and Apple and what have you, are so powerful that, and unless either a government actually rules in favor of you must introduce a fairer system, those organizations are not going to change their commercial models. They're onto a good thing, and they're not willing, unless it's Taylor Swift challenging, they're not going to be willing to alter the financial model. I think the second thing is that the recording business and the streaming business are, to me now, very difficult commercially, because they are basically a new form of music communication. In other words, they're the way of spreading the word about classical music to a wider populist public or a wider public. And that is a good thing. So in other words, if you start to look at the streaming services and the recording companies as the way to make sure that your art is promulgated, not paid for, but promulgated, then you have to say it's still a good thing, and streaming is a good thing. The economic model is, run by such powerful organizations. I don't see, of course it's going to be fair to charge by the second or fair to pay a bigger rate, but where are you going to get the muscle to impose that on Apple?
This is more personal, and I hope you don't mind me asking you, but I think this says a lot about you. You lost your wife to cancer some years ago. You yourself have suffered ill health a little in recent years. You're presently dealing with your son Jamie's complicated and serious medical issues. Yet somehow you seem to continue to work as diligently as ever. Someone once said to me that you have a particular gift for compartmentalising issues and problems, which allows you to cope with very busy and stressful periods. Is this something you recognise about yourself, and have you deliberately developed this skill?
Yes, it is something I recognise about myself. And no, I haven't deliberately developed it. I think it's developed by taking on more and more and more work and trying to find ways of managing a rather big agenda of stuff. I mean, at IMG, that was really enormous amounts of work. And I had a wonderful team of people around me without whom I couldn't have done it. So yes, compartmentalising, obviously I recognise, and no, I haven't deliberately developed it.
I think you should do coaching or something, give workshops. It's a useful skill. Are you optimistic about the future of classical music still, despite all the challenges and the increasing competition there is now for people's leisure time and spend?
I have to be optimistic. There's no other choice. We have to find ways forward. I mean, the alternative to that would be to be pessimistic, and there are lots of reasons to be pessimistic. But when you look at the finest conservatoires and their orchestras and the look on people's faces in those orchestras as they play repertoire for the first kind. And I must say, working for the Colburn School has been an eye-opener in terms of the skill, enthusiasm, and total commitment of the teachers there, and the corresponding, quality of the music making by the students. I mean, we brought the Colburn Orchestra to the Edinburgh Festival in Dublin, and I don't think I've been as excited by any concert than the one they gave with Stéphane Deneuve. I mean, there was an edge to the playing and a kind of rediscovery, or discovery in their case, of music that was incredibly uplifting.
That's what you hear when you hear the European Union Youth Orchestra,
Yes,
isn't it? And
yes.
Gustav
Mahler.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, there's something special there.
And I find when I hear the Chamber Orchestra of Europe, I see the qualities, those same qualities, and matured. In other words, there is a spirit of the playing by top quality players, and that keeps the inspiration of having been a youthful member of an orchestra like that.
Last question. You've had one of the most notable careers in the classical music business in the last 50 years. Do you have any remaining ambitions? And also, how do you reflect on your life in music?
I don't really reflect on my life in music because that's the past, and the past was interesting and exciting. I live in the present and the future. My ambitions are the same as they've always been, which is to find interesting new projects and to help make them happen, basically.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Stephen. Great to talk to you.